On the battlefield, in the thick of the fight, the soldiers of the kingdom of Eberunia spotted the enemy commander. Diana, struggling to breathe in the smell of blood that permeated her armor, understood that there were too many. But the valiant warrior decided to take as many enemies with her as she could. And she launched into the attack with fury. The knights surrounded the heroine on all sides, and in an instant she felt fear and the desire to stay alive, despite the warrior having been on the battlefield for over 20 years. She was just a wretched piece they could discard at any moment. But even so, a true warrior must not pity their own life, because that would be a sign of cowardice. At one point, Diana fell under the assault of the enemies, and they immobilized her on the ground. Then the commander of the Everunia army, Cornelius Hymen, appeared on the field, with whom she had been fighting like this for 5 years in battle. The hero was fed up and ordered the warrior's helmet removed to finally see their face. But a few seconds later, he was speechless from the shock, seeing that rabid dog that bothered him so much was a girl. The kingdom of Agrafana lost the war, and Cornelius wanted to end the battle with the death of its commander. However, he felt sorry just killing such a charming lady, with beautiful crimson hair. She thought he was crazy, which made the hero laugh. How to fight against her for 5 consecutive years and remain sane. He decided to let her choose and find out. How did she want to be remembered? As a lady or as a knight? Upon hearing that he had grown fond of her during all that time, and that was why he allowed her to choose, Diana smiled ironically and thought this day was crap. She was a lady, but also a knight. And she was a knight, but also a lady. Therefore, there was no reason for her to consider these two concepts incompatible. Surprised by her words, Cornelius asked for her name and then introduced himself. Then he wanted to hear her last words. And smiling, the heroine wished to die from a single blow, as she couldn't bear the pain. Cornelius also smiled and signaled to his subordinate with his hand. Upon hearing the crunch of steel seeking her neck, Diana swore she would never touch a sword again. A second later, she snapped her eyes open in a soft, warm bed in a bright room. She sat up rubbing her head and heard the voice of Olga, the maid, offering her water to wash with. The protagonist looked at her, shocked. It had been so long since she had seen that maid so young. Suddenly, she understood that she was in her room at the Rislai estate, an almost forgotten place. Thinking it was just a dream, she lay back down hoping to keep sleeping. Olga thought Diana was ill, but she insisted she was fine and dismissed her. The maid, worried, went to find a doctor while the heroine settled in, closing her eyes. It had been so long since she felt such absolute peace and tranquility. This dream was too happy, but also too real to be just a fantasy. Approaching the mirror and observing herself closely, Diana didn't understand. Had she really returned to the past? Now she wasn't older than 10, although there was one detail that made her doubt her time travel. The destructive power the heroine possessed, for some reason, still remained with her. At that moment, a servant abruptly entered with a message. Her lord was calling for her. Diana remembered that the turning point in her life occurred around this time. In her previous life, she went to her father, who decided it was time for her to learn something to support herself. He gave her the choice between learning the art of the sword and etiquette lessons for ladies. This time, the heroine resolutely headed to him to make a different decision and change her destiny. In her past life, she chose the sword, and that led her to that tragic end. When she entered the Viscount's office, he decided that, having turned 10, it was time for her to learn to fend for herself. His words were identical to those Diana remembered from her past life. Her father also expected her to choose the sword and serve her family. The protagonist now noticed that the Viscount was very young back then. She used to fear his gaze, but now everything was different and she felt compassion for him. His slender hands never grasped a sword. His body was thin. Why did she fear him? She imagined throwing him over her shoulder, and inexplicably, he felt a chill. He believed she should learn to use the sword, but she wanted to take etiquette lessons. She doubted being useful as a knight. She was weaker than her sister Regina. What a disaster. She wanted to be a lady, so she asked for etiquette lessons. After hearing him, Diana left. She remembered the hard path of the night. She had to work like a mule without stopping. The heroine trained on the field all day, to the point of not being able to move her hands in the end. It was endless training. And if you skipped a day, it was hard to catch up with the others the next. However, Diana now decided to discard those useless thoughts, as she was no longer a knight. She was going to be a lady. Clouds appeared in the sky, and soon a downpour fell, which irritated the heroine a bit. Suddenly, Regina appeared in the hallway. She had heard about her younger sister's illness and thought she didn't look that sick. Besides, the older sister knew Diana was going to take etiquette classes and thought she should still become a knight. The reason was that Regina didn't understand. How could a girl with impure blood become a noble lady? The heroine was shocked by such audacity, and she also didn't understand. What nonsense was she talking about now? Diana's mother was the Agrafana princess, although she was the daughter not of the queen, but of a concubine. Therefore, the heroine decided to ask her sister. Did she know who her grandfather was? Regina knew it was the late king, but that didn't matter. The royal family had rejected her mother. After these words, Diana finally remembered why she disliked her older sister so much. Regina was the daughter of the Viscount's first brother and his late wife, a marriage for love. The heroine was born after an arranged marriage, and her mother also passed away shortly after. Her father openly showed favoritism, and while Diana bathed in blood on the battlefield, her sister lived in luxury. While the heroine fought between life and death, Regina changed expensive jewels daily, always surrounded by opulence. But Diana never envied her position, because the family prestige and those treasures were earned with her own life. And now she decides to make it clear that if they truly abandoned her mother, the Viscount's family is garbage. The heroine also realizes that her sister ignores the subtleties of marriage of convenience. She still has much to learn. Regina, furious at those words, decides to forbid Diana from calling her sister again. The heroine calmly accepted, which further enraged Regina, who turned around and left indignant. Looking thoughtfully out the window, Diana decided she would never acknowledge that fool as her sister. That same day, the butler introduced the heroine to Baroness Williams, who would be in charge of her etiquette lessons. The woman, in an elegant dress, stepped forward and greeted the young Viscountess with a curtsy. Diana had never heard her name and assumed her father had assigned her a teacher from a little-known family. Upon greeting the lady, the heroine thought the Viscount just wanted her to give up on becoming a lady herself. However, there was a small problem. She had never in her life received etiquette classes to be a lady. So, when trying to curtsy, she fell headlong onto the floor. In front of the Baroness, a deathly silence fell in the air as Madame Williams began to nervously bite her lip. For a second, the thought crossed Diana's mind that perhaps it would be better to give up on all this. The Baroness proceeded to train her greeting, the foundation of everything, noting her good posture. She explained each movement step by step, and Diana tried to imitate her. But everything went wrong. Again and again, Williams forced her to repeat the same gestures, hoping for a better result. The shoes were a torture in themselves. The heroine had never worn anything like them. By nightfall, the Baroness decided that Diana needed to get used to the footwear. Tomorrow, they would continue the same way. Minutes later, Olga was perplexed by her mistress's grim appearance, sitting thoughtfully in the armchair. Suddenly, the heroine jumped up shouting and decided that she could do it. Frightening the maid tremendously, she remembered that it was only thanks to her willpower that she had managed to rise to commander. Diana stood in the middle of the room and began practicing the greeting alone, while the maid thought she was strange. The next day, she greeted her etiquette instructor perfectly, exceeding all expectations. The woman stood petrified at the entrance, unable to believe what she was seeing. In reality, the protagonist practiced all night, and Billams thought she was mocking her. If she was so good at this, why did she behave so strangely yesterday? Furthermore, the Baroness expected the protagonist not to spout nonsense about learning in one night. But it was true, and Diana didn't understand why she would mock her in that way. The woman refused to believe it until her gaze fell upon the girl's heels. She was horrified to see those wounds, but the protagonist clarified that it was because of the shoes. Willems wanted to call a doctor, but Diana didn't see the need. They were just scratches. Her words disconcerted the Baroness. Didn't the maids react to the wounds? The protagonist remembered that they asked how she felt and then changed the subject. Before, Williams only had suspicions, but now she was sure that the heroine was being blatantly ignored in that family. The fact that they sent a baroness distant from high society to be her teacher. And the servant's indifference said it all. The woman immediately ordered the maids to call the doctor and bring slippers for the young lady. While treating Diana's wounds, she decided to clarify that the first thing the girl needed to change was her way of thinking. A lady's body was a jewel that must be protected from any injury or harm. Only then would her value be fully appreciated, so she had to stand out among the others at all costs. The heroine was confused because she had fled her future and chosen another path. But she found herself again on the battlefield called high society. Williams decided to find out. Was Lady Diana ready to fight in this war for attention? The girl smiled in response and decided this must be very interesting. The Madame extended her hand, and in that case, she was willing to help her achieve a crushing victory in every battle. Diana joyfully shook her mentor's hand. War was her specialty. Every year, the royal family organizes a banquet on Orville Day, in the palace itself. All the aristocrats of the kingdom must attend this party, under the pretext of being a place of friendship and harmony. In other words, it was a battlefield where hypocrisy and false smiles are the weapons. If it were a normal battle, she wouldn't hesitate, but here she would have to try very hard. After attending the party with her father and sister, she found an exit to the balcony with an incredible view. She approached the railing, fascinated by the starry sky, until she noticed something strange. A white-haired boy was below. Upon recognizing him, Diana felt a deep shock. Cornelius Hymen was in front of the palace, staring directly at her. The heroine looked at him perplexed, not understanding what he was doing there. This seemingly harmless boy will become the commander of the Everunia Empire. Suddenly, a knight grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the railing. It was dangerous to lean out like that. His name was Bancroft Crowell, and he wanted to know where the young lady's tutor was. In her past life, she would have beaten him up for touching her without permission, but now she had to behave like a lady. And Diana tactfully ordered him to let go. The knight immediately jumped back and offered her his deepest apologies. The heroine looked outside instantly, and seeing no one, for a second she thought she had imagined it. Bancroft, meanwhile, thought he shouldn't have grabbed her like that, but still believed it was better that she wasn't wandering around alone here. Meanwhile, Diana barely managed to recognize him due to his youth and recalled that, according to rumors. This knight held a low rank for a long time. She wanted to stay there a little longer, and then the hero decided to stay on guard. Many believed his advancement stalled because he was unsociable, but that wasn't the real reason. The heroine introduced herself and heard that Bancroft belonged to the Crowell clan without an hereditary title. That means that in his family, the title is not inherited, therefore he was a commoner. That's why his promotion took time, and now he thinks that if his origin bothers the lady, he will bring another knight. Upon hearing that a knight is defined by his sword, not his origin, and that Diana considered him worthy, Bancroft was astonished. Those words deeply moved him, and he decided that the young lady could call him Ben. The heroine sensed that perhaps he was going through a difficult time, but he had to be strong. Because in the future, every single knight will admire him. Meanwhile, Walter was in shock over the young master's actions, who even wanted to sneak into the palace. And although the servant was very confused, young Cornelius was ecstatic to have met her in person. Walter became even more perplexed. Did anyone recognize the young master? In reality, the young hero had recently been dreaming of a red-haired warrior. She often sighed, looking at the sky, thinking about how tired she was of everything. Cornelius, on the other hand, was amazed that seeing that woman quenched his thirst. That unknown thirst began to haunt him since memories suddenly appeared. He had become like dry land, and that warrior was a blessed rain for him. After that, the young hero began to observe her life in dreams, even when he took up the sword for the first time. He also saw her first battle, and that fateful night when the girl's life ended abruptly. Besides her, he saw himself, already an adult and clearly beside himself. Perhaps that same thirst led him, in the end, to madness. Upon hearing that she wanted a quick death in a single blow, the boy ran to save her. But at that moment he woke up, and with the girl's death, he stopped dreaming of those visions. However, now he was willing to do anything just to see her smile again. And now he ordered Walter to give him the dagger, something that greatly disconcerted the servant. With the knife in hand and cutting his long hair, Cornelius wondered if he could find the heroine on the battlefield. The young hero wanted to meet her at all costs and was even willing to learn how to wield a sword for it. The next day, Bill Eames decided to give a lesson on protocol theory. And she wanted to know from Diana. What did Lady mean to her? The heroine, with a serious face, began to consider different options, from a girl to an aristocrat in a dress. The woman rushed to clarify that ladies were beings who needed constant protection. Because what is valuable always needs care, and that was the basis of any lady. So now she wanted to know again, what did that word mean to the heroine? Upon hearing that she herself was a lady, the madam choked on her tea. Wiping her mouth impassively with a napkin, she took pity and accepted the answer as good. The woman understood that no one in that mansion protected the girl, and that she couldn't help her in high society. Diana had to learn to defend herself alone, and for that, she must be given a weapon. So Williams decided she could use her innate beauty. For a lady, having a beautiful appearance was a great advantage. Especially if she had red hair, Diana became distressed and didn't want to use it, as she had always hated the color of her hair. For a knight, red hair was useless at best and often a hindrance. Due to her striking appearance, she had to endure many insults directed at her. However, that wouldn't repeat if you once taught a good lesson. The instructor wanted to know who will protect the heroine when she leaves the family estate. She didn't understand. Does Diana never plan to marry? How barbaric. She needs to win people's hearts, and her appearance can help. Let's start with the maid Olga. Bilam knew that the maid is always with her. The heroine must win her over. The heroine didn't want any of this. But if she no longer wields a sword, she needs at least a weapon to defend herself. After the lesson, she thought that if not knighthood, an arranged marriage awaits her. What a fate! Suddenly, she ran into her sister and her etiquette teacher, who had decided to end the lesson for today. The man seemed very irritated and thought that if she is always so unprepared, they won't be able to continue with the lessons. It wasn't the first time the instructor had scolded Regina, who just stood there, crying. After this, he left, hoping she would prepare for tomorrow's lesson, and the heroine continued down the hallway. Seeing Diana pass by calmly without flinching, the sister stopped crying and burst into fury. She started shouting at the protagonist, believing her younger sister was mocking her. Diana scratched her ear, not understanding why this brat was barking like a dog again. Ignoring her screams, she kept thinking about marriage. She hoped he would at least be handsome. Suddenly, the protagonist saw Olga, who at that moment was carrying a basket of clothes. And she was heading towards them. She immediately remembered her mentor's words about drawing her to her side. And the first thing was to inspire compassion. Beauty attracts gazes, but if combined with sadness, it will awaken the desire to protect in the other. And now a perfect opportunity presented itself to put it into practice. The protagonist put on her most pitiful face and apologized to her sister, deciding that she should have always helped her. Regina, in shock and completely confused, stared fixedly at Diana. The protagonist regretted not being able to be a support for her sister, and with tears, she apologized. Olga was stunned by the scene and the young lady's words, unable to contain her admiration. The older sister insisted on getting an answer, while Diana understood from the maid's reaction that she had acted well. Thinking it would be easy, she abruptly cornered Regina against the wall, taking her completely by surprise. Smiling at her in a way that almost made Regina age, Diana reiterated her decision to help her sister in everything. At that instant, the girl's heart skipped a beat. Her soul evaporated, and she turned completely pale from fear. Furthermore, the admiration disappeared from Olga's face, being replaced, and now the maid was very confused. Overall, the protagonist was satisfied and congratulated herself again for having done everything correctly. But suddenly, Regina shouted loudly and began calling her dad, leaving Diana in a state of shock. She didn't want this at all. But it was too late, and the older sister ran off to complain to her father in his office. The protagonist was now perplexed. Had she made a mistake in something? She looked at Olga, who, for some reason, was also avoiding her gaze. But suddenly, the maid gave her a thumbs up. Even she felt better. Diana lit up with happiness and expressed her sincerest gratitude. However, Olga thought she shouldn't be so happy. The young mistress had a terrifying face, and maybe she had overdone it a bit. Even now, seeing the protagonist's look of astonishment, the maid understood why the 12-year-old girl couldn't handle so much pressure. Later, Diana wanted to know why Olga felt better. Had Regina been bothering her? The maid didn't even want to remember it. Once she found stones in her food. Another time, the clothes she had painstakingly mended appeared completely torn. There were other small, malicious acts that the protagonist knew nothing about. Was it like that in her previous life? She needed proof to completely destroy her later. Olga was shocked again and clarified that ladies do not express themselves that way. But in any case, the maid was grateful for her mistress's support. She didn't think Diana would care so much and show affection. She was worried that Regina would tell the master everything and Diana would suffer, but she didn't take it seriously. Maybe it didn't turn out as expected, but Diana was satisfied. Upon returning to her room, the butler gave her an invitation to the Viscount's office. The heroine smiled and followed him, thinking her father was predictable. The servant was surprised by her confidence. And he thought Diana was different from Regina. He even felt like he was seeing the late lady of the house. Before she entered, he clarified that most likely the lord was with his elder daughter. Recently, Regina ran to him crying her eyes out, which terrified the Viscount. She decided nothing serious had happened, and then the father understood that Diana had offended her again. The girl began to defend her older sister in a feigned manner, which further enraged the Viscount, who ordered her to be called immediately. The butler was sure that the protagonist had done nothing wrong. Besides, Regina had a habit of exaggerating everything. Even if it is unfair, she will have to apologize to the master, and then he surely won't punish her. Diana responded with a calm smile and decided to take his words into account. After this, she calmly continued towards her father's office, while the servant was stunned. He watched her walk away and didn't understand. When had she grown so much? Upon opening the office door, she saw the Viscount with an unfriendly face and, hidden behind him, her older sister. After seeing Diana, Regina stuck out her tongue and hid behind her dad's back again. The father didn't understand how the heroine dared to look at her sister with contempt and even threaten her with death. Diana wanted to reply, but suddenly she understood that perhaps, from the girl's perspective, it did look like a threat. The Viscount was about to call to complain to Lady Williams, but upon seeing the heroine's face, he froze in fright. This time, Diana decided to try harder and offer apologies humbly. But instead of a smile, a sinister grimace came out. The Viscount paled instantly and, in a trembling voice, ordered Regina to go to her room. He stood between them, both, and protected the older one from the younger one the whole time, until she managed to reach the door by going around him. When Regina finally left, he coughed and decided to find out. Where had Diana gotten all that from? The heroine didn't understand what had gone wrong this time. If she had already offered her sincerest apologies with a smile. Holding his head, the Viscount resolved that she must not show that smile to anyone else. He was still in shock, unable to believe that his own daughter terrified him so much. And she even reflexively drew her dagger. For him, it was the definitive proof. She must abandon etiquette lessons and start training with the sword now. But Diana stood firm, refusing to drop her lessons with Baroness Williams. No way. Yielding to her determined gaze, her father gave her 2 months to master the basics of etiquette. Perfectly. Soon Princess Juliana's maid would be chosen, and the heroine must be her. Or he would send her to the training camp. Diana was shocked by such conditions. But there was no other option. Destiny hung by a thread. Walking to the forest to breathe fresh air, she couldn't believe she would have to be His Highness's personal maid. After circling the clearing and jumping over a log, she reached the secret spot only she knew. Her refuge. As a child, when her mother scolded her, she would hide there, making it the perfect place to reflect. Diana accepted her father's demands, but doubted whether she could become the princess's servant. Would she manage it? Picking up a branch from the ground and infusing it with her power. Did she consider that maybe it was better to just kill them all? The heroine never felt patriotism, nor did she have family, let alone friends. Therefore, she could easily sell military secrets to Avernia and then escape there. She just had to take Olga with her. But the problem was that no one would believe her words. However, there was one person who surely would believe her. And that was the naive madman. Cornelius Hyman. In her past life, during the war against Avernia, Sub-Captain Diana suddenly received a letter. It had no seal or information, so it was unclear who had actually sent it. After reading in the message content about a military secret of the enemy kingdom, the heroine was perplexed. She decided to trust the received information and launched an attack, using that knowledge. As it was revealed later, the squadron they defeated was led by Cornelius's older brother. Diana never imagined she would use her enemy to destroy her own brother. This madman is capable of anything to achieve his goal. That's why the heroine was sure he would believe her. But on the other hand, it is better to avoid madmen like him. And if they crossed paths, the heroine decided to flee at full speed. Suddenly, she noticed that the color of her power inside the branch had turned bright red, instead of the usual yellow. In shock and confusion, Diana threw the branch far away and she herself recoiled suddenly. Thinking she might have vision problems, she cautiously approached and took the branch again. She filled it with energy, and upon seeing the yellow color, she sighed in relief and thought it had really been her imagination. But suddenly, the force changed back to red, which left the heroine even more astonished. Not understanding anything, she had always sincerely hated the color red. And of everything she possessed, what she liked most was Laura's color. But now, for some reason, it had turned red. Does this have something to do with her returning to the past? Diana, furious, broke the stick and swore she would never be human again if she wielded a sword. Meanwhile, the heroine's father thanked his lordship for recommending his viscounty at the royal court. They were already preparing Diana, but the viscount didn't understand why they had chosen his younger daughter. In his opinion, she wasn't as brilliant as required, and they might waste this opportunity. Upon seeing a threatening look, the viscount immediately bowed, but decided to clarify one more thing. That same day, the father met with his daughters, and to Diana's surprise, he was not alone. Upon hearing that this young man would be her knight, she was stunned, and Regina almost dislocated her jaw from the shock. Ben respectfully greeted his new mistress and considered it an honor to serve her. Besides, he was happy to meet her again, but Diana was rather bewildered. She didn't understand why a royal knight was there and what had happened to the palace. Upon hearing that he left his post to become her knight, the heroine thought that he too wasn't very sane. The sadness of the world was reflected in Regina's eyes, looking at them through tears, and calling her father in a low voice. The viscount silently turned away and started to leave, as he couldn't do anything to change the situation. The older sister, desperate, bit her nails. She couldn't believe Diana had a knight before her. Meanwhile, the heroine wanted to know why Ben had made that decision. If many yearned to be royal knights. Furthermore, the viscounty wouldn't be of much help for advancement, but the boy didn't care at all. He was of low birth, and although he was lucky enough to be a knight in the royal court, his peers treated him like waste. He still remembered the young lady's words, that a knight is defined by his sword, not by his origin. Ben had never heard anything like it, and she was the first person to judge him by his sword. Not by his lineage. It was then that the boy decided that, from that moment on, he and his sword would only serve her. Diana understood him, as she too wished to be judged by her sword, not by her gender. So if he had decided it, there was no turning back, and she only had to accept it. The knight wanted to thank the lady, but Regina approached, eager to meet Sir Crowl. Suddenly, an idea sparked in her sister's mind. She no longer cared that the knight belonged to Diana. She could snatch him away. She decided they were family now, and hoped the brave warrior would allow her to call him by his name. Regina looked at the heroine haughtily, convinced that things would soon be in their place. She was sure he would be better off as her knight than as that pathetic Diana's. With a smile, Ben forbade her from calling him that and turned back to his mistress. Together, he and the heroine inspected the surroundings, leaving Regina sunk in confusion. Later, Diana sat at the table with a worried air and took out her embroidery kit. An essential skill for a lady. Olga firmly believed in her success, wishing the young mistress luck and patience. For some reason, the protagonist felt that her words even sounded offensive. Composing herself and concentrating, she took the needle and prepared to begin. But Diana, unintentionally, filled the needle with her aura and upon touching the fabric, pierced it. She was in shock. Had embroidering always been such a dangerous activity? The protagonist tried to calm down and reminded herself that she wasn't fighting. And she tried again. Finally, after hours of hard work and concentration, Diana finished her first embroidery. The design left much to be desired, but at least she hadn't poked holes in the fabric. With hard work and under the strict supervision of Lady Williams, the heroine was learning to be a lady. But as always, the instructor noticed every detail and decided her walk lacked soul. It was too energetic, and her walk seemed more like that of a knight than a refined lady. Diana was shocked by that accuracy and couldn't help but agree with her. True ladies walk lightly, like a feather, and their steps are like butterfly wings. A single posture won't fix all of this, and the Baroness hoped the heroine would understand it. However, Diana didn't understand anything, and sighing, Williams decided to end the lesson for today. Later, the heroine was sitting on the stairs, wondering why walking like a lady was so difficult. Suddenly, she saw Regina walking down the hallway and noticed she had an excellent way of walking. At that moment, the older sister felt a chill run down her spine. Diana thought perhaps she should try starting to imitate her. But suddenly, the light dawned, and she remembered that besides Regina, there was a much better role model. The most irreproachable lady the protagonist knew was her late mother. She was a princess, and therefore mastered royal etiquette perfectly. Diana tried her best to remember everything about her mother, particularly her way of walking. When walking, the woman turned her whole body towards the direction she wanted to go. She also straightened her shoulders, and her steps were measured and short. The protagonist gathered her courage and decided to try to completely copy her mother's movements. Meanwhile, in the Hyman Archduchy, a servant ran to his lord with urgent news. His Excellency thought Cornelius had done some madness again, but according to the subordinate. This time it was much more serious. A bunch of servants gathered in a room and looked perplexedly at the training ground. In the middle of the field was the Archduke's second son brandishing a sword, under Walter's supervision. His father, arriving there in person, didn't understand what Cornelius was doing now. The young hero demonstrated his exceptional intelligence since childhood, but unfortunately he was very physically weak. The cause was a thirst of unknown origin, which made him very sensitive and irritable. In the end, when his patience reached its limit, this manifested in eccentric behavior. And now, upon hearing the Archduke's question, Cornelius fell silent, and then Walter decided to intervene. But His Highness didn't want to hear anything, and ordered the young hero to follow him to his office. He didn't know what had happened to his son for him to decide to learn the art of the sword. The sword wasn't for him, and considering Cornelius got exhausted climbing to the second floor, he himself should understand it. Furthermore, for some reason he rejected the private tutor, and the Archduke wondered. What bothered him this time? Upon hearing that the young hero replied that he had nothing to learn from him, the man looked at him closely. In the last class, Cornelius left a pile of books in front of his teacher, leaving him perplexed. The boy thought that, if the tutor opposed his opinion even after reading them, he would write him a letter. And in that case, the young hero would surely reply. But until then, classes are cancelled. In the end, the teacher did write a letter, where he crossed out the Archduke's second son as conceited and rude. Cornelius thought that hearing his nonsense almost made his ears fall off. What else was he supposed to do? His father reflected a bit and decided that in that case, his son could learn directly from him. Those words meant, indeed, that the Archduke wanted to make him his successor. But the boy didn't think much of it and hurried to reject his proposal immediately. His Highness immediately exploded, which greatly surprised Cornelius, who remembered what his father used to call him. When the hero was very young, the Archduke used to compare him to a little monster. The father didn't know how to respond and slumped, lowering his head. Cornelius smiled in response. He turned and headed towards the exit. He considered the title of Archduke a mere tie and wanted his stupid older brother to take care of it. Walter was waiting for him at the office exit, hoping the young master was all right. The servant understood that the master had surely scolded him, and Cornelius would stop training. He wanted to suggest going to the library. But suddenly, the young hero decided to go to the training ground and continue practicing. He was fed up with this physical weakness, and Cornelius wanted to push himself to the maximum. Later, Walter decided to ask why he suddenly wanted to learn the art of the sword. If he didn't even like moving before. Before, the young hero was always buried in a book, and except for eating and sleeping, he spent his free time surrounded by books. In response, Cornelius also wanted to know if Walter would believe what he saw in his eyes if he met the girl from his dream in real life. The servant was confused by such a question. But did Cornelius care whether he believed him or not? The young hero knew that he loved his sword, and that disconcerted Walter even more. The servant didn't understand. Could it be that the young master traveled to Agrafin because of this? But Cornelius ordered him to be quiet and decided that if the heroine lived in his country, he would try to attract her with sweets. Or a sword. However, now everything will be much harder, and it was necessary to find another way. While Walter tore out his hair and considered the young master crazy, the hero decided to take advantage of the war. He can catch her directly in the war. And at this idea, the boy felt a chill run through his body. Meanwhile, the servant decided that this unknown girl should flee without looking back. Because the hunt had begun. At that moment, in the royal palace of Agrafin, the princess went for a walk in the company of her servants. Everyone around her was amazed at how elegant she was, and they believed the king must surely be proud of his daughter. Juliana Agrafana was the only official princess of this country, but besides her, there was the king's illegitimate daughter, Agnes, who happily ran towards her sister. The princess was surprised. She didn't expect to find her sister there. It turned out that Agnes longed to see her, as she heard Juliana would soon have a new friend. She thought her sister was lucky, and if she lived in the palace, she would play with her all the time. She regretted it wasn't like that and envied the princess, who remained completely serene. Juliana continued her walk impassively, while Agnes wouldn't stop circling around her. She wondered if her father would grant her request if she wished to move to the palace. Then the princess sighed worriedly and thought that maybe Agnes had a dry throat, and she should have some tea. The girl immediately refused, but her sister feared she would talk nonstop and damage her vocal cords. Agnes was moved by such attention and was happy that her little sister cared about her. She continued to rave about her kinship with such a pleasant person, while Juliana watched her calmly. Afterward, the girl ran off, determined to return another time, after which the princess addressed the maid Margaret. Juliana thought that if her younger stepsister was in the palace next time, it would be better to change the walking route to another garden. At the same time, she understood that she didn't like Agnes at all. Moreover, she learned from the maid that her new maid would be Diana Risley, the Viscount's second daughter. with family ties to royalty. Upon hearing that her mother was Princess Vivian, Juliana thought her father had been too harsh marrying his daughter off to a viscount. Margaret rushed to clarify that she was also his second wife, which left the princess completely astonished. Over time, the protagonist managed to become His Highness's personal maid. And Bill Eames was absolutely delighted. The lady looked at her protégé with tears and decided that it hadn't been in vain to instruct her for so long. Diana took it as flattery. It was only thanks to her mentor's hard work that she achieved such results. Those words touched the Baroness's heart, and she was absolutely delighted with her kindness. But at the same time, Bill Eames completely agreed. It was the most impossible challenge she had set for herself in her life. In any case, she now considered the protagonist a worthy lady, for whom the position of princess's maid would be a good start. Diana decided to always remember it, and at that moment, it was time to hurry to the carriage. Ben was by the carriage entrance and courteously offered his hand to his mistress. Then he mounted his horse to accompany her. Besides Bill Eames, the protagonist was also seen off by her father and her sister, who watched their departure in silence. When the carriage set off, Regina decided to find out if the Viscount would really send his sister there, or if perhaps it was a mistake. She was sure Diana would surely make a mistake with the princess, but according to her father, the decision was already made and could not be reviewed. In the end, the girl remained there alone, completely powerless to change anything. Upon approaching the royal palace, Ben decided to ask if his lady was nervous about meeting Her Highness. As expected, the protagonist did feel a strong agitation inside. However, it was more anticipation than worry, as the palace was almost like her home. The knight thought there was no need to worry, as the princess was very kind and mature like Diana. In reality, the protagonist knew more or less what kind of person Juliana was. And that's why she wanted to stay away. At the entrance, Diana was greeted by the princess's head maid, who wanted to instruct the newcomer on her duties. But before that, she started circling her and examining her closely from all angles. Fortunately, the protagonist's clothing was completely appropriate, and from now on she had to dress with equal care. After this, the head maid ordered the newcomer to follow her, and, by the way, she decided to remind her that, from now on, she would be Her Highness's face. This means that Diana's reputation will directly affect the princess's reputation. Upon reaching the door of the hall where Her Highness was waiting, the woman knocked and heard the invitation to enter. The protagonist entered immediately, and the princess was happy to finally see her. Diana was surprised by her beauty and respectfully greeted Her Highness. Juliana had never had friends her age, and that's why she was really happy to meet her. Moreover, they were also relatives, which meant they could surely be good friends. The protagonist considered it an honor, and for a split second noticed something strange in the princess's gaze. After meeting, the girls sat down for tea, and the princess became curious. Could she call her maid by her name? Diana took it for granted, which greatly pleased Her Highness. A tea party was soon planned, and Juliana really wanted the protagonist to participate as well. Diana felt flattered by the proposal and happily accepted, and the princess decided that this was exactly where she would introduce her to everyone. Her Highness now looked like a normal girl, which somewhat unsettled the protagonist. Diana returned home in the evening, and Olga rushed to ask how her first day at the palace went. She felt uncomfortable because of the maid's curious gaze and determined that, overall, the princess was very kind. However, at one point, the protagonist felt a strange discomfort looking at Her Highness. Olga became worried, and then Diana decided to change the subject, remembering that she had been invited to tea. The maid considered this event amazing and thought the young mistress was very lucky. To her surprise, Diana did not share the enthusiasm for this at all, and on the contrary, she was thoughtful. Pretending to be tired and wanting to rest, she ushered the maid, who wanted to hear more, out of the room. Meanwhile, Juliana was playing chess calmly, and suddenly the head maid addressed her. The woman decided to clarify that Her Highness had told Lady Risly the wrong time for tea. Upon hearing that she knew and should let it go, the woman was astonished. Since that girl yearned to be the princess's maid, Juliana decided to test her. So much happens in high society, and as her maid, she must know how to handle it. Therefore, she should leave it as it was, and the head maid could continue with her tasks. The woman was perplexed. The princess always acted sensibly, and now this. The next morning, Juliana arrived early to see how the preparations were going. It was the first time she organized something like this, and she couldn't allow any mistakes. The servants hurried to assure her that there were no problems. She shouldn't worry. The princess felt everything should be perfect, except that her maid would be late. Juliana longed to see her face when she finally appeared there. But suddenly, a maid blurted out that everything was going so well thanks to a lady sent by Her Highness. Just then, Diana was calmly chatting with nobles, without the slightest composure change. Seeing her try a pastry with that satisfied face, the princess didn't understand what she was doing there. Upon seeing the princess, the heroine rushed to greet her and celebrate the good weather together. Juliana could barely contain her astonishment and decided to ask her why she had arrived so early. Diana pretended to have confused the time and almost arrived late, but fortunately, she arrived early to see the garden. Clutching her fan with trembling hands, the princess wondered if she thought she would swallow that lie. Diana, for her part, smiled serenely, aware of Her Highness's confusion seeing everything going off track. Although, thinking about it, maybe this cunning young lady really thought she would fall for her trap. Well, she was wrong. Diana had lived in the palace as a royal knight for more than 20 years. This morning, she disconcerted Olga with her early departure, pretending it was habitual. As the only female knight in the palace, all the negative attention was focused on her. But she learned to deal with it. She just needed to wake up earlier than anyone else and work even harder, so that no one would have a reason to criticize her. Upon arriving at the tea location, she was surprised to see that the preparation and setup of the tables were in full swing. Knowing that the start would be imminent, the heroine understood everything and decided to help the servants. And now she extended to the princess a plate with cookies that were simply exquisite. Meanwhile, Diana thought this little one would need about 20 years before she could beat her. Later, the princess's friends respectfully greeted Her Highness, who thanked them for their valuable time. Meanwhile, many were seeing the princess's new maid for the first time and watched her with interest. Everyone wondered where that adorable lady came from and if she was already this charming. What would happen next? When everyone took their seats, Juliana took the floor and officially introduced her new personal maid and friend, Diana Risley. The ladies were happy to meet the Viscount's daughter, and the heroine greeted the guests personally. Some were amazed that, despite her youth, she already knew how to behave with such grace. Diana thought she still had much to learn and hoped for her help to master palace etiquette. However, the attention on her grew every second, and some considered her too modest, while others were interested in her beautiful dress. Juliana thought she was also surprised, because the etiquette, the style, and Diana's way of speaking were like those of a seasoned knight. The heroine looked at her in confusion, and the guests took it as a joke. However, some ladies noticed something knightly about her, despite her elegance. And her dress. Someone guessed that perhaps she had learned to handle a sword, but others disagreed, since Diana's handskin was too clean. Astonished by such conversations, the heroine quickly clarified that she spent her days studying etiquette, and that she had no time for chivalry. Juliana did not intervene anymore, and watching everything from a distance, she let out silent giggles. That cunning brat was already starting to irritate Diana, who looked at her through clenched teeth. When tea time finally came to an end, the exhausted heroine got into her carriage. Exhausted. Peeking out of her window, Ben wanted to know how her first tea went. The knight was not worried at all, as he knew that Her Highness would surely take care of her. He hoped that her words about the princess being kindness personified were true. Diana decided that he too should receive a couple of pranks from Juliana to understand her feelings. However, the heroine remembered that in her past life, the princess had a completely different character. And it was unclear what was happening now, as they barely knew each other and Juliana had no reason to hate Diana. But if they throw the heroine out of the palace now, her father will consider her useless and put a sword in her hands. So she couldn't wait for that fate with her arms crossed. She had to make the princess side with her. The next day, Diana decided to ask Olga what girls the princess's age liked. It seemed strange to the maid to hear that from someone her own age, something the protagonist constantly forgot. But suddenly, Olga remembered that lately, romance novels were becoming very popular among girls. And they were successful not only among common people, but also among young noblewomen. At that moment, Diana was suddenly encouraged and decided to go with her to a bookstore. Shortly after, they entered the bookstore, and the seller wanted to know if the ladies were looking for anything in particular. The maid thought her mistress was looking for something appropriate for her, while the protagonist went to check out the shelves. It was the first time she had seen such a collection of books, and only now did she realize that she had lived a life without exposure to reading. She found a romance novel, became curious, and decided to read a little. In the book, a certain Rosalina observed the middle-aged woman in front of her. The lady was trying to bribe her with jewelry so she would forget about the existence of her son. But she refused. The woman started yelling at her, and Rosalina thought the lady had simply misinterpreted. But the lady immediately ordered her to remember her place and not dare to call her mother. How dare an insignificant girl like her be near her precious son? Rosalina understood that she couldn't delay any longer and decided to confess that she was already pregnant with him. In the end, after reading several chapters of this story, Diana completely lost track of time. The book was incredibly addictive, only surpassed by eggs. Upon hearing that her mistress wanted to stab an old witch, Olga was stunned. The next day, the heroine visited the princess again, whose days were passing monotonously. Sometimes she would take a walk, but almost always she was studying, and after lunch she would have a cup of tea. When Juliana rested, Diana had to accompany her, and this time she prepared a gift for Her Highness. Picking up a romance novel and looking at the cover with skepticism, the princess coldly commented that she didn't read such things. She had neither the time nor the desire to read such vulgar books, which would only appeal to the silliest noblewomen. And although Juliana appreciated the generous gesture of her protégé, she was forced to refuse such a gift. The protagonist smiled sweetly, thinking she was a bore. Since from the first page it was clear that the book was great, she discovered that the princess read instructional books in her free time. She would take walks or embroider, and also play chess. Juliana understood the surprise on Diana's face, as in her kingdom, everyone believed chess was only for men. No one in the palace could keep her company, and the princess often played alone. So the protagonist offered herself as an opponent. Very surprised by the proposal, Juliana immediately ordered her servants to bring the game board. When the game began, she warned that she did not intend to show mercy to the novice. Diana smiled, downplaying the importance. She did not want Her Highness to worry about trifles. In the end, after half an hour, the heroine checkmated her opponent, leaving her stunned. Amazed by her play, Juliana thought it was a coincidence and asked for another match. Minutes later, the princess, blue with shock, savored her 10th defeat. She didn't understand how Diana was so good. Did she perhaps have an innate talent? The heroine pretended it was luck, knowing that Juliana would never discover the reason. The princess wanted a rematch, but just then the head maid arrived. Upon hearing that Lady Agnes was waiting for her, Her Highness's face hardened instantly. Soon, a pink-haired girl happily greeted her older sister. Moreover, Agnes was happy to meet Juliana's new little friend, about whom she had heard so much. Although she was the daughter of a concubine, she received the royal surname, which meant the king truly loved her. Diana greeted the girl respectfully, but she simply ignored her and ran to her sister. Upon hearing that she wanted to play with Juliana, the protagonist was surprised. She thought they weren't that close. At that moment, the princess decided that Agnes should greet Lady Risly properly. Showing manners. The girl pretended to think, why the hell did she have to do something like that? What a nuisance. Juliana frowned, fearing they would blame her for such rude behavior. At that moment, the heroine felt a strong tension in the air and understood that their relationship was truly terrible. Agnes looked surprised. How could anyone even think of reproaching her for anything? The head maid rushed to clarify that the girl was old enough to have manners. Diana thought at that moment that Agnes was surely going to burst into tears. But the girl smiled and remembered that it had always been like that, and there were no problems, so it's okay. Moreover, she decided that her older sister worried too much about her. The protagonist felt real panic and thought the princess might sweep everything away. Seeing that Juliana was busy with the guests, Agnes decided to leave them and go. She passed by Diana, who, out of the corner of her eye, noticed a malicious smile on the little girl's face. The princess was also clearly beside herself, but she contained her emotions better, revealed by a throbbing vein on her forehead. Most likely, Agnes will occupy a higher position than Juliana and only seems like a harmless brat. Suddenly, the princess addressed the protagonist, wondering if she was going to stand there, enduring that look of superiority. Diana didn't know what she could do, but Juliana had given her permission to use her as a shield. The protagonist could not give in to that girl's provocations. Her reputation affected the princess's reputation. With a tired sigh, Juliana wished to rest and decided to give her maid the day off. Diana thought that her highness did not like her, but it turned out she was completely wrong. The princess always speaks in hints and roundabout ways, and like a defenseless child, she vents her anger when she can. But still, the heroine couldn't help her in anything, and simply left. Juliana, meanwhile, went to the terrace where they played chess to sit and breathe fresh air. Her head was hurting terribly, and suddenly she saw a romance novel forgotten by Diana on the table. Picking up the book and opening the first page, she was curious to know what was so special about that cheap reading material. Already on the first page, the writing skills were horrible. It lacked realism, and there wasn't a hint of educational information. Shortly after, the head maid brought the princess a calming tea, because after every visit from Agnes, her head hurt. The woman, smiling as always, brought the tray to her mistress, but her highness didn't even flinch. At that moment, Juliana was absorbed in reading and didn't even hear the maid arrive. The lady placed the tray beside her and decided to inform her that this tea relieved headaches. The princess ignored her again, and then the head maid shook her by the shoulder, after which she reacted. Juliana was confused, and thinking she wasn't feeling well, the woman insisted again with the tea. Believing it wasn't urgent, her highness plunged back into the book and decided she was fine. The maid wasn't so sure, but she was immediately ordered to leave the tea and attend to her own business. As she left, the woman looked back and saw how the princess, without taking her eyes off the book, was groping for something on the table. Fearing she would spill the tea on herself this way, the head maid hurried to help before it was too late. But suddenly, she saw that her highness was grabbing a cookie and calmly starting to eat it while reading. The woman sighed in relief, and Juliana soon felt herself getting better. Over time, Diana got used to visiting the palace almost every day. Moreover, her relationship with the princess also began to improve noticeably day by day. However, the times of peace unfortunately did not last long. One day, the protagonist was greeted by the head maid near her highness's room, who told her that the princess had ordered that no one should enter. Diana immediately became curious about what had happened, and apparently they were having trouble. It turned out that the king had recently decided to bring his illegitimate daughter, Agnes, to the palace. The woman knew that at that moment, Juliana wouldn't even let her in, so Diana could leave. However, the protagonist still decided to visit her mistress, and decided that the head maid had no need to worry. Diana also knew that the princess had been locked up for several days. Knowing her highness, she surely doesn't open up to anyone and isolates herself, drowning in her thoughts. Perhaps this little girl is sitting right now, crying alone, completely solitary. Finding a cotton ball on the floor with surprise, the protagonist saw the princess sitting with her back turned. Diana called her carefully, and at that moment, Juliana froze with scissors in hand and a face of total bewilderment. In front of her, on the floor, lay a teddy bear that she had been cutting pieces from. Blushing intensely and hurrying to hide everything, Her Highness shouted and ordered Diana to leave immediately. The protagonist was in shock, and it was the first time she had seen the elegant and graceful princess in that state. Jumping up suddenly, Juliana, with an impassive face, decided she was furious for having ignored her order. Still in shock and looking at a piece of cotton in her hair, Diana thought it was a coincidence. The princess thought that, since her maid had come anyway, why not play a game of chess? At that moment, Diana was completely convinced that Her Highness was not such a bad person after all. Meanwhile, Cornelius continued training every day and suddenly lost his balance during one session. Falling to the ground, he suffered a minor sprain in his foot, and Walter thought the young master was overdoing it. The nanny was also worried about him, and the servant believed perhaps he should rest a bit. However, the young hero got up and, wiping the sweat from his forehead, decided it was too early to rest today. He knew that, at one time, the heroine cried alone at night. No one comforted her, and for them to recognize her, she did everything possible. But sometimes, she also cried in solitude. And when her hands were covered with wounds and scars, she became a true knight. Therefore, Cornelius believed he had no right to rest and could not waste a minute. Moreover, he had to become a knight at all costs. Years later, Diana continued to visit the princess as her personal maid. One day, she heard Olga say that a delegation from the Everunia Empire would arrive soon. Realizing that the moment had finally arrived, the heroine wanted to go to the palace immediately. Shortly after, Ben arrived at the royal palace without any problems, ready to offer his hand to his mistress. Before Ben stood a wall that had stopped his growth. What did that mean? Walking alongside him through the palace, the heroine decided to ask if the knight had made progress. Ben saw no reason to worry and was sure he would overcome this wall, to protect his mistress even better. However, Diana wanted him to do it not for her, but for himself. If he had stayed in the palace, he would already be holding a high position. That's why the heroine believed he would succeed. Because, just in case, she might really need his help. Everunia making a move only means one thing. An inevitable war will begin soon. Later, Diana had tea with the princess, who called her several times. The protagonist didn't react, and Juliana didn't understand what she was thinking so much about. Was she perhaps seeing someone? Diana was stunned by the question, and then the princess gestured in a certain direction with her gaze. In that direction sat a young aristocrat who was apparently infatuated with her. He couldn't stop throwing languid glances at the protagonist, and all the time he puffed out his chest like a peacock. Just looking at him made Diana feel nauseous, and she wished Her Highness wouldn't joke like that again. He was the son of Viscount Bailey, whose family was incredibly wealthy and had only recently received the title. The protagonist didn't want to know much about him, and she wasn't sure he was looking at her. At that moment, the young man ruffled his hair and winked brazenly at Diana. At that instant, even the princess turned pale and turned away, mentally apologizing to the protagonist. Meanwhile, other aristocrats were debating the news of the imminent delegation from Eberunia. Upon hearing that they were seeking an alliance with the Kingdom of Agrafana, Her Highness visibly sagged. This alliance would be forged through a political marriage, an unbreakable bond between royal families. Juliana was the only princess of the nation, and whether she wanted to or not, she would inevitably be the candidate. The princess composed herself instantly, thinking that the delegation was only coming to discuss the union. The nobles quickly clarified that that country already had an heir princess and an engaged prince. Did they intend to take her as the prince's second wife, an outrage for all of Agrafana? The scandal was immediate, but Juliana imposed silence, recalling the empire's laws. She would accept any decision from her father if it benefited the kingdom, no matter the cost. Diana knew that, beneath the apparent calm, Her Highness was burning with silent indignation. Meanwhile, Cornelius finally arrived in these lands through the portal, along with Walter. On every visit to this place, the servant noted with amazement how fertile these lands were. This is very different from Everunia and other countries. That's why many try to keep a peace. The hero thought more and more that Diana would soon belong to him. After the party, the princess personally escorted all the guests to the exit. Then she sighed in relief and decided to find out. Where is the heroine now? Upon learning that she went to deliver the gifts to the palace, the princess hurried to look for her. However, Diana was haggard, and Juliana was very worried about her state lately. The heroine did not react to her call, and the princess felt curious. Why is she silent? She placed her hand on the maid's shoulder, and suddenly, Diana knocked her to the ground. Upon recovering, the heroine was in shock. Why was Her Highness lying on the cold floor? Juliana was amazed by her words, and with a trembling voice, decided to remind her who had put her that way. Upon understanding what happened, Diana paled and was horrified, while the princess howled in pain on her back. The heroine immediately ran to help her get up, hoping she was all right. Juliana smiled mockingly and thought Diana was crazy if she believed she would get away with it. Cursing herself for her old habits, the heroine began to apologize desperately. However, Her Highness was more interested in knowing what the devil she was thinking about. She longed to know the reason why she had been thrown down like that. But Diana remained silent and looked away, which further confused the princess. She didn't understand. Did the heroine wish to be punished for disobeying and hurting a member of royalty? That wasn't the problem, but Diana didn't know how to say it. Juliana seemed so strong. Before the last portal to Everunia, the princess will be murdered on the way, without stepping on her land. After the death of Her Highness, the tension between the two countries will escalate into war. Actually, the heroine planned to flee to the neighboring country before all this happened. But now, a blonde princess from Agrafana has completely altered that plan. Diana did not want to get involved. After all, she is destined to die. But now, the heroine could not abandon her to her fate. She had to find a solution. One person cannot stop a war. And even less so did Diana want to make that sacrifice. Now the heroine tries to explain that it is hard for her to express it, but she will speak when she knows the answers. Juliana rejected her words. How dare her servant evade her question? Then, Diana pretended to have received news of serious problems at home, and that she had to leave urgently. The princess grabbed her hand. Did anyone let the heroine go just like that? She didn't understand. In the end, Diana had to use all her eloquence to sound convincing. And finally, she managed to slip away. But that's where the good ideas ended. Why did any of this make sense? What to do now? It would be difficult for them to escape just like that, taking the princess of an entire country with them. They would be pursued. And even if they managed to hide, the war would not stop. They would find excuses to fight. It was inevitable. Meanwhile, Ben noticed the thoughtful expression on his mistress's face and wanted to know what was worrying her so much. The heroine preferred to evade the answer and pretended she simply had something important on her mind. The knight knew he wasn't good enough for that and doubted he could be useful to his mistress. But if you share your worries, they are halved, and if you share happiness, it multiplies by 100. That's why he was always willing to listen to her. Whatever happened, and Diana was very grateful to him. Meanwhile, Regina watched them from the corner, biting a napkin out of pure envy. Suddenly, the protagonist sat down to have tea with Ben, which took him completely by surprise. She pretended it was just about knowing how to relax, but in reality, she wanted to help him tear down that wall and overcome it. This guy was an exceptional knight, and if he weren't here, he would have been promoted a long time ago. He wanted to clarify that he didn't know how to enjoy tea, but Diana hurried to reassure him. It was very difficult for her at first. Just a couple of years ago, she didn't even know how to greet correctly. But thanks to an excellent teacher, she learned everything. Day after day, she practiced her greeting in heels. And her feet screamed in pain. Ben could hardly even imagine it, since from the beginning of their relationship, he remembered her as a perfect lady. Deciding that there is always a first time for everything, the protagonist knew that one day he would overcome the obstacle. To do this, Diana wanted to give him a small hint so that he would discover it himself. Then, she remembered Baroness William's words that ladies should be like a flower and a jewel. At first glance, that sounded nice, but in reality, both objects are meant to be admired. However, the protagonist did not want to become that kind of lady, and that's why she chose the path she wanted to follow. In her past life, she only did what she was ordered to do, and Diana felt that she had lost herself. She never made decisions for herself, and she was just another piece on a chessboard. That's why she didn't want Ben to live like that too, and she believed that as soon as he understood, the obstacle in front of him would be insignificant. The knight slowly digested what he had heard, understanding that in her story about herself, there was also a path for him. Diana noticed with a smile that perhaps, if they compared themselves, there were certain similarities in their paths. Later, the protagonist was reading a book in her room when Regina entered to tell her that her father was waiting for her. Diana got up calmly and went towards the exit, passing impassively by her older sister. Suddenly, the girl grabbed her arm, and the protagonist looked at her with total serenity. Regina wanted to know what kind of relationship her younger sister had with Sir Crawl, shocked by such nonsense. Diana replied that their relationship was like that of a lady and a knight, hoping that would be enough. She didn't know what was going on in her older sister's head, but she didn't want to get involved in that. Continuing on her way, the protagonist hoped not to hear such questions again. Because they are offensive. Regina was indignant at such words and decided that, in reality, she was the one who was offended. She didn't understand why it was always Diana who hogged everything. Knight Ben's lady and the princess's friend. After a brief silence, the protagonist thought that none of that had ever belonged to her older sister. To her surprise, Regina agreed that it had nothing to do with her. But the older sister felt something strange, as if none of it should belong to Diana either. It was as if, since she refused to take up the sword, nothing had gone as it should have. The protagonist was totally confused by what she heard, and in shock because Regina blamed her for everything. Continuing on her way, she suddenly came to the conclusion that perhaps her sister's words were not so far-fetched. It was her fault that everything went wrong, and Diana had never stopped to think about it. Never. And now, with all this, she wonders, why the hell did she return to the past? She wonders if anyone would believe her if she told her story. Would anyone? Meanwhile, she entered to see her father and, from the doorway, heard someone asking for her hand. Her father didn't find it strange. The princess will marry soon, and Diana will stop being his puppet, so it's her turn to find a husband. The heroine didn't understand which family they were talking about, and it turned out that the son of Viscount Badley was very fond of her. Remembering that weirdo from the palace, Diana shuddered and was shocked. She started losing consciousness and falling to the floor, at which point the butler rushed to help her. After a while, she woke up in her bed, just as Olga was bringing her hot soup. The maid couldn't imagine the stress she suffered, to the point of fainting in the master's office. Diana quickly clarified that she wasn't in shock because of the wedding, but because of who the groom was. Now she is morally and physically weaker than before, but she still loves being a lady. At that moment, the butler ran in, with urgent news that the princess was looking for a heroine. Meanwhile, Cornelius arrived as an ambassador from Everunia to the royal palace of Agrafana. And he thanked them for the warm welcome. The king considered it his duty to receive them as they deserved, as their nations were allies. In turn, Walter was amazed at how well the young master was fulfilling his responsibilities. He was very worried when Cornelius offered to lead the delegation, but his fears were unfounded. And the hero negotiated wonderfully. Even when the master wielded a sword for the first time, it seemed like he would give it up in a couple of days. But now he is a worthy knight. After finishing the conversation with His Majesty, the hero decided to go to his room with his servant. The atmosphere was good, and the negotiations went like a dream, without problems, so Walter believed the master's dream was prophetic. The servant also recalled that red-haired lady from the dream, whom the master mentioned frequently. Even the servant wondered now, where is she and what is she doing? It turned out that Cornelius also did not know the answer to that question. Walter was shocked by such a turn of events, and that the young master still hadn't found out anything about her. However, if Cornelius started taking an interest in her, he would attract too much attention. So for his own good, he shouldn't do it. The servant was very surprised by his words and didn't understand. When did the young master learn to be so considerate? Leaving that question unanswered, the hero wanted to know if the servant felt the presence of divine power in Agrafana. It was similar to the white aura that Cornelius possessed since childhood, but with a slight difference. Surely there is someone with divine power in this kingdom too, although Walter preferred to hear about that lady. He had heard his master say that she was a knight and wanted to know how strong the girl was. The hero thought he had never seen anyone stronger, and the whole world watches her brandishing her sword. Suddenly, the servant saw a red-haired lady ahead and decided to ask if it was her. At that moment, the heroine, having just arrived at the palace, was walking down the path towards her meeting with Her Highness. Walter was astonished at how much she matched his master's description, and Cornelius froze. Her clothes were very different from those of a knight, and it was incomprehensible. Why was she there? She was supposed to be training on the practice field at that moment. Upon crossing paths with ambassadors from the Heverunia Empire, Diana Rilsey, the Viscount's second daughter, greeted him respectfully. The hero longed to know why she was there, and planned to find out with the greatest naturalness and disguise possible. But surprise overcame him, and in the end, without further ado, he simply asked her what she was doing there. The servant turned pale upon hearing him, and thought that the young master must regain his senses before it was too late. The heroine looked at him in confusion, and suddenly, enlightenment struck her with full force.